The Commedia Dell'arte. Literally translating to comedy of the profession, Commedia is characterized by ensembles of over-exaggerated stock characters and improvised dialogue, performed by actors in masks and costumes associated with particular characters. Now, let's look at the unfamiliar theater tradition. Commedia may have come from Atellan farce, originating in Italy in 300 BC. Atellan farce was improvised farce that utilized masks to signify character. These plots were often lowbrow humor, although they included dramatic elements. Early Commedia likely consisted of tradesmen who were not classically educated in theater, functioning as casual entertainment for these workers after their workday. These troupes were likely a response to the political and economic crises going on in Europe in the 16th century. The primary goal of the Commedia through its improvisation was not only to make audiences laugh, but to continue to be relevant, frequently critiquing modern high society. Through the 16th century, companies of players gradually coalesced in cities. The official birth of Commedia and the Western Theatre Company came in 1545, when a company formed in the town of Padua, putting down on notarial paper that this was a formation of a company of comedians. From the end of the 16th century to the 17th century, some troupes gained massive acclaim and were requested in royal courts in Europe, leading to the golden age of Commedia dell'arte. But unfortunately, all things must come to an end, and it declined in the 18th century, as it became more reliant on pantomime as regional dialects and jokes were lost on foreign audiences. Commedia also lost elements of improvisation, leading to characters to become stale and concrete. This all led to its gradual decline in the 18th century. Now, let's look at the performance aspects of Commedia. Fundamentally, Commedia is an adaptable art form. Usually, Commedia would be performed wherever a stage could be found, on streets or in royal courts. Lighting design was non-existent because of these impromptu sets, but sometimes music from traveling musicians would accompany these performances. Each Commedia performance had a scenari, which was a loose plot, and a conchavia, which actors improvised dialogue on top of, based on common cultural stories. Because of this, Commedia had the ability to get through censorship, leading to political commentary and lewd humor. Despite being mostly improv, there are scripted elements in Commedia such as the lazzi, rehearsed elements of slapstick comedy routine performed at planned points in the show or to cover dropped lines and transitions. Let's look at the stock characters in the Commedia. These are the main driving factor and what differentiates it. Each stock character was identifiable by a half mask that they wore with exaggerated physicalities, a main source of comedy. Each stock character could be divided into 3 categories: innamorati, vecchi, and zani. The innamorati were the young lovers, generally melodramatic and vain, focused on the love between them. Notably, they did not wear any masks and dressed in high fashion and makeup. The 2 innamorati getting together would be the main focus of the majority of Commedia shows. Then we have the vecchi and the zani. The vecchi were the old men. They were greedy and egotistical, being the main roadblock between the innamorati's love. They moved self-importantly, taking up space and dressed in high-class clothing. 3 main vecchi appeared across the Commedia. Il dottore, a pompous academic. His mask consists of a bulbous nose. He frequently speaks in Latin non sequiturs. Pantalone, an old miser. His mask consists of a hooked nose and bushy eyebrows or mustache. He speaks musically. And Il capitano, a bragging soldier. His mask consists of a long and unambiguously phallic nose, according to author John Rudlin. Finally, there were the zani. These were the servants. They spoke in a lower-class, more vulgar accent. Dressed in tattered and patchwork clothing, their masks would also feature long noses. Zani moved in a low-status manner with strength in their steps. They drive the plot of the Commedia, creating most of the action. Now, although Commedia declined in the 18th century, there has been a rise in interest in modern day through the connection that these stock characters have to modern theater, leading to concerted efforts to reinforce and reinterpret this art. But let's move on to the physical exploration and performance of this convention. There are 4 aspects that make up a Commedia character: costume, mask, speech, and stance. Since I want to further explore aspects of these characters, I will be focusing on stance for communication of Commedia. The use of masks in Commedia obscured the subtleties of an actor's facial expression, placing a heavy emphasis on movement for communication of emotion. Along with this is Commedia's place as a stock art form, further emphasizing large characterization. A character would have a repertoire of traits that they could come back to. Allison Wilson, a Commedia Dell'arte writer and artistic director, claims there are 5 important practices in physicality for Commedia. 1. Characters must act on their thoughts. 2. Characters have large actions, but they portray them in truth. 3. Characters have one drive, be it food, money, or women, which they wholly pursue. 4. Characters are physically committed to their actions with big gestures and interesting stances. And 5. Characters would integrate their masks into themselves by moving with it. If they had no mask, they must make one with their props and movement, such as the innamorati. Now, moving on to character and physicality. The physicalities a character presents is focused specifically on dramatically emphasizing the traits they possess. For example, Pantalone, the old man. He stands in a hunched, bent-over manner to be protectant of his gold. He moves with a wide stance, his knees pointed outwards to exemplify his ego, but also tell of his concerns of his own virility. He is slow with a stiff body due to his old age, and is constantly gesticulating his heads and hands to demonstrate how conniving he is. Another aspect of stance is using animals for physicalization. Because the base desires a character have play such an important part in them, they are often compared to animals, and masks draw inspiration from them. Thus, actors are also meant to take inspiration from them in their movement style. For example, Pantalone is derived from the hawk. He moves his head around constantly like a calculating hawk, and has bursts of energy much as a hawk does diving. This is my physical experimentation with Commedia. Beginning with Commedia movement, I chose to focus on the physicalities and stance of Pantalone, as I had access to a modern Pantalone mask. I initially began with the base desires to build a foundation for this character. I donned the mask and spent about an hour acting as his animal, the hawk. I began to walk around and would squawk and even pretend to fly. This ultimately proved to be of diminishing returns, as I did not learn much from this besides how to be a hawk. Utilizing animals is not an effective way to craft Commedia characters. They need this truth of humanity. Animals should be inspiration, not foundation for these characters. So I took a different approach. I began to wear the mask of Pantalone around for extended periods of time while not working on theater. I even wore it to some of my classes, as you can see in this presentation here. That helped me to adjust and integrate it into my face and movement. Within my theater class, I began to outwardly express Pantalone's physicalities of a hunched back, bent legs, knees pointed outward, moving with my hips, and a constantly gesticulating head and hands. This helped me to get into the headspace of Pantalone and think what he thinks and what drives him. Immersing myself in this character allowed me to become committed to my actions and bring truth to them. I also use various performance materials from Commedia and non-Commedia productions where this Pantalone old man archetype appears. One of these is a monologue from Urinetown, the musical, delivered by Caldwell B. Cladwell, which I shall present as Pantalone.
Do you remember the stink years, Mr. Strong? Those years when the water table began to drop and just kept on dropping. No one thought they had much time, and many of us did questionable things. Much like the things that are happening right now. There was the looting, of course, and the hoarding. Riots broke out like there was no tomorrow. For there was no tomorrow, but there is always a tomorrow, if you're tough enough to cling to it.
This aptly demonstrates the Pantalone archetype in modern theater. Now, let's move on to my reflection of my learning. Studying the skills of Commedia dell'arte has made me more conscious of the movements I utilize in acting, specifically in high comedies with stock characters similar to the Commedia. I pay attention to every joint in my body and isolate my limbs, but combine them to make cohesive movements, much as Pantalone does with his stiff body but gesticulating arms and wide stance. I have begun to build repertoires of movement and stances for the characters I portray to utilize in improvisational manners. The stances as movement I use are now always done with intention, even if they may be wrong. I think about what drives the character, how their circumstances influence them, and what their thoughts in a moment are, rather than falling back on the excuse of simply being what the character would do. Let's think about the application of this. For example, I was recently in a production of Urinetown the Musical. I played the main antagonist, Mr. Cladwell, a stock old man, father of the female romantic lead, similar to Pantalone as the father of the Innamorati. He is greedy and shrewd, almost a perfect parallel to Pantalone, possibly because of Urinetown's lampooning of theater as a whole. Utilizing inspiration and movement from Pantalone, I could further characterize Cladwell and elevate his comedic performance while still truthfully portraying him, an important aspect of the character. Another instance where Commedia can be applied in performance, while less direct, is realistic dramatic works. I was in a production of What the Constitution Means to Me by Heidi Schreck at Portland Center Stage, playing the role of the young debater, essentially myself. Prior to that point, I had not considered how I acted as myself to a great extent, so initially I was lost. But utilizing the conventions of Commedia, it is possible to create a character that is true to oneself while still being a mask. It would allow me to present a version of myself that I was acting of, free from my normal awkwardness and other things the audience should not see in the theater arts. Now, what are the relations Commedia has to other forms of theater? Almost every Western theater tradition after the 17th century was influenced by the Commedia dell'arte in some way. Punch from Punch and Judy is an evolution of the Zanni Pulcinella, who solved problems with violence. The French Pierrot evolved from Pedrolino, a sad servant in whiteface thought to exemplify the struggles of an artist. Even the works of Shakespeare and Molière included a plethora of allusions to and inspirations from the Commedia with their use of stock character. While Commedia may have declined, its legacy is categorically carried on. Even looking at other unrelated theater traditions, there are comparisons to be made. Kyogen farce is a traditional form of theater with intent to make audiences laugh. It is performed during intermissions for or alongside formal Japanese dance theater. Now, let's look at the differences between Commedia dell'arte and Kyogen farce. Kyogen does not include mask, unlike the plethora in Commedia. After its incorporation with no theater, Kyogen was primarily performed on a particular stage, while Commedia could be performed anywhere. In more recent Kyogen farce, comedy skews away from vulgar humor, a stark contrast to Commedia. And Kyogen was passed orally from family to family, while Commedia is passed around culturally. But there are far more similarities than differences. Both Kyogen and Commedia were initially improvised around a loose plot, although both were eventually codified and written down even in the 17th century. Both are spoken in a way meant that is easy to grasp, both seek to entertain through slapstick comedy, both rely on stock characters with large physicalities for humor, and both include aspects satirizing the wealthy, although admittedly Kyogen theater lost much of this in royal courts. Well, Commedia did so even to its downfall, eventually being banned by Napoleon in the 18th century for its political activist roots. The similarities between Kyogen farce and Commedia dell'arte, two traditions almost entirely geographically separated in Japan and Italy, reveal a greater aspect of theater as a whole. Theater always has a topic to comment on, whether it be it politics or normal life. The combination of stock characters and improvisation allows for this directly, as the comedy is both paradoxically relevant and established, critiquing social and political factors. As the comedy is codified, the stock characters do not disappear, but rather evolve into templates for the modern theater. So, foundationally, theater is an art form in context, influenced by all of the aspects around it. There are certain things common to every theater, and this is what the Commedia dell'arte has shown.